our intuitions about material objects are inconsistent. We have intuitions that clash with each other, and so if we want to tell a consistent, coherent story about what material objects are, how they behave, their identity over time, and so forth, you're going to have to say somewhere something counterintuitive. And so it's just a matter of choosing, all right, where is that going to be?
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Justin Mooney. He is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the College of the Holy Cross, and his work is focused on metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and more. His recent book is Phases of Objects, which will be our focus for today, and he has various published articles on this and other related topics. But yeah, feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome, and thanks so much for being here, Professor Mooney.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm happy to be here. Excited to talk about the book. I have a copy of it here, which I'll show because I'm really happy with the cover art. I like hippos, and we were able to work a hippo into it.
Yeah, actually, I just did notice that on your website that you included that you're a hippo enthusiast.
Yeah, and, that's
right. So I noticed that on the cover there. Yeah, great. So I guess just to introduce the book, can you give a little bit of a background on the sort of questions and puzzles that'll be relevant to the book that you'll be exploring in there?
Yeah, so there's a sense in which the whole book is kind of inspired by one solution to one puzzle, and then it ends up expanding to cover others and touch on others. So the one puzzle that I'm thinking of is the classic puzzle of the statue and the piece of clay. And so here's one way to set it up. Suppose you have an artist who has just a lump of clay and they mold it into a statue. Well, it turns out there's a really good reason to think that the statue and the piece of clay are one and the same object. And there's also a really good reason to think that they're two different objects. So the reason to think they're one and the same object is once you have the statue all molded and shaped and so forth, it is located in the same place as the piece of clay at exactly the same time, and they're made of exactly the same matter. And normally, at least before we're corrupted by philosophy, we think, oh, you can't have two objects in the same place at the same time made of the same matter. That's just bizarre. And so that's a reason to think, well, these aren't two objects, they're just the same object. On the other hand, there's a really good reason to think, no, they're two different objects. And that is that there seem to be some differences between the statue and the piece of clay. And so just for example, one of those differences is it seems like the piece of clay has been around longer than the statue in the example that I just gave. It seems like the statue wasn't there until the artist molded that piece of clay statue-wise. So the puzzle is, what do we do? Do we say that the statue and the piece of clay are the same object? Do we say that they're two different objects? And either way we go, how do we make sense of that? Well, there's one solution. I mean, there's a bunch of solutions to this puzzle, a bunch of candidate solutions. There's one in particular that has appealed to me for a long time, and it's called the phasalist solution. It was dubbed the phasalist solution by Dan Corman. And it goes like this. It says, hey, look, what's going on here is that the statue or the piece of clay is just going through a statue phase. So it's sort of like, a human being can go through different phases of like a phase of being a child, the phase of being an adult. Well, similarly, a piece of clay can go through the phase of being a clay statue. And that's all that's going on here. So there's one object, according to this solution, and it is a piece of clay originally, and then at some point it starts to be a statue. So no new object comes into existence when it's molded, when the statue is molded. It's just that an object which was already there and wasn't yet a statue starts being a statue. Okay, so what am I doing in this book? I'm basically taking that solution to the puzzle of the statue and the piece of clay and some similar puzzles, and trying to develop a metaphysical picture in which that solution kind of finds a home. So I want a broad metaphysical view about material objects and how they inhabit the world and so forth, and the way they change and their identity over time, that fits with this solution to this puzzle and similar solutions to similar puzzles. So that's what I'm up to in the book.
Good. Yeah. I have to admit, before hearing about this book, I hadn't even heard of phasalism as a view. So I wonder why you think it isn't a very well known, or it's somewhat neglected as a view or as an approach on these matters. Like, why do you think that is?
Yeah, and here I can only speculate. I really don't know, why the view has been so badly neglected, but you're right, it has. And I just wonder, so one possibility is that maybe it just strikes people as implausible on the face of it. Maybe people just think this isn't a plausible solution to the statue puzzle and so forth, and so nobody has bothered to pursue this. That's a possible explanation, but I actually am inclined to reject that explanation. And this is all anecdotal, but I find that when students are presented with the statue puzzle, they tend to go for the phasalist solution first. And I know of at least one other person who has said the same thing. So anyway, that's anecdotal evidence, but you might think, okay, actually it's kind of plausible on the face of it. And so the reason for its unpopularity has to be something else. What else that might be, I'm honestly not sure. There were a couple of people back in the 1970s, for example, Marjorie Price, who defended robust versions of phasalism, but it didn't catch on for some reason. And so here I am in 2026 trying to sort of revive it, I guess.
Yeah, no, good. I do think it's worth reviving, and definitely at least exploring and try to kind of make a plausible view out of it, or at least see the consequences and so on. But yeah, okay. So getting into phasalism, then, okay, we might have to introduce what sortals are for people who aren't really familiar. But I had this question, like, what's the difference between saying between this view and saying that all sortal properties are phase sortal? And so and what do you think of that view about sortal properties, I guess?
Yeah, good. Okay. So I should say maybe something about how I define phasalism in the book.
Sure.
Because I end up saying something much more broad than just, oh, here's a way to solve a certain puzzle, right? So what I do is I say, very roughly, phasalism is the view that when you have an object of one sort that turns into an object of another sort, the original object survives that change. The object at one end of the change is numerically identical to the object at the other end of the change. So in the case of the piece of clay on the statue, the original piece of clay is identical to the statue you get at the end. But more generally, this is true. So if you take a car and you crush it into a block of scrap metal, the car at the beginning is identical to the block of scrap metal at the end, right? And so on and so forth, with various examples of objects changing from one sort to another. So very roughly, that's the view. How I end up kind of defining phasalism. And then the rival of phasalism, substantialism, just says, no, at least in some of these cases, the original object is distinct from the one that you get at the end. Okay, so as I've defined it then, that is different from saying that all sortals are phase sortals. Now, sortals, I talk in the book about sortal properties rather than sortal concepts or sortal terms, which was more common in some of the older literature. But so sortal properties are just properties that correspond to sorts of things. So a hippo is a sort of thing. So being a hippo is a sortal property, right? Being a car is a sortal property. Being a tree is a sortal property. So what about this view that all sortal properties are phase sortals, which just means that all sortal properties are properties that an object, roughly what it means is they're all sortal properties that objects can gain and lose without thereby beginning or ceasing to exist, right? Like being a child, right? I lost that property, but I didn't stop existing when I did. So the difference in between these two views is this. My view is a view about material objects and the kinds of changes that they can undergo and survive. And so it's not really a view about sortal properties per se. It just has consequences for sortal properties, very direct and obvious consequences for them. And so if you were to say that all sortal properties are phase sortal properties, you would be committed to a lot more than what I'm committed to in this book. Not just, for example, that being a statue is a phase sortal property, but also the sortal properties of, say, abstract objects like numbers and properties, if you think there are such things, that those too are phase sortal properties. And I'm not very much drawn to that view. So you ask, like, what do I think about this view? I mean, I'm not completely, like, I don't want to completely rule it out, but I haven't seen what I would take to be a good reason to endorse that view that's even more radical than my already kind of radical view. And I think the reason is roughly this. So my motivation for endorsing phasalism as I define it has to do with what is the best way to handle certain puzzle cases like the statue, or more generally, what's the best way to interpret sortal changes that generate those puzzle cases. What's going on there metaphysically. But those puzzles are puzzles about material objects. They're not puzzles about like other kinds of entities like abstract objects or events or what have you. And so that motivation doesn't extend then to all sortal properties across the board.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And I was thinking about something. You gave that example with a car being crushed into a bunch of scrap metal. One intuitive reaction someone might have to this sort of phasalist view is that, well, maybe this is plausible in that case, or maybe it's plausible in the statue case. But like, what if it underwent more changes? It could look like, if you had the car and or the lump of scrap of metal going through radical changes, even if gradually, it looked like, but that's not still the same object, right? At some point, like if you turned it into a foot of the Eiffel Tower or something, it's like, that's the same object as the car. Like that seems like the wrong result. I think a lot of people would think. So, I mean, I guess, what do you think about this sort of intuitive reaction that some people might have to the view?
So my view is that is an important intuition that I take seriously, and I consider it to be a substantialist intuition or an anti-phasalist intuition. And so my whole approach to dealing with intuitions is I take them seriously, but I regard them as defeasible. And so what you have to do is you have to balance a bunch of different theoretical virtues, including one of them, which privileges intuitions in a certain way. And you have to say, all right, overall, what's the best view that we can come out with here? And it's tricky because even if you were thinking only about intuitions, our intuitions about material objects are inconsistent. We have intuitions that clash with each other. And so if we want to tell a consistent, coherent story about what material objects are, how they behave, their identity over time, and so forth, you're going to have to say somewhere something counterintuitive. And so it's just a matter of choosing, all right, where is that going to be? And my view is you have to kind of make judgment calls about balancing the scales here, not only among intuitions, but among other factors like simplicity and so forth.
Right. Yeah. So do you mind talking about that a little bit more? Because you talk in the book about conservativeness, explanatory power, simplicity, and the role of intuitions. How does that... Maybe talk a little bit more about your methodology and like how that gets applied here a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The way I approach metaphysics, I think I say in the book, is it's the way you might expect someone who likes first order metaphysics to approach it. And so it's not an unusual approach, though it is a controversial one for sure. And it's roughly like this. I want to say, look, when we do metaphysics, we have to compare metaphysical hypotheses that are generally explanatory in some way. They're trying to explain something about the world that's puzzling in a metaphysical way. And in order to compare those hypotheses and decide which one are we going to prefer over its rivals, you have to have theoretical virtues that you use to assess them. You have to look for, like, okay, which of these hypotheses is more virtuous than another in one respect or another respect, and then you kind of, again, you do this sort of like judgment call thing where you're balancing, different factors against each other. And so I think that there are three theoretical virtues that are sort of the most important. setting aside some that are like almost too obvious to state, like internal coherence, for example, right? Setting aside those, I think the three most important virtues, in my view, are conservativeness, explanatory power, and simplicity. So by conservativeness, what I mean is fit with intuitions. So my view is that we all kind of have pre-theoretical intuitions about the metaphysical structure of the world, and especially about material objects, which are very familiar things to us and that we sort of think about all the time. Um, and so we have these intuitions, and they sort of paint a picture of the world for us, a sort of superficial picture of the way things seem on the surface. And I call that picture phenomenal metaphysics. And so the idea, or my way of casting out the virtue of conservativeness, is in terms of how far does a hypothesis deviate from phenomenal metaphysics versus how closely does it adhere to phenomenal metaphysics. The more closely it adheres to phenomenal metaphysics, the more conservative it is. That's the idea of that particular virtue. But conservativeness is certainly not the only virtue, and we do have to sometimes say things that are counterintuitive, and other virtues come into play here. So the second one that I focus on is explanatory power. And this is because, again, like I said, I think metaphysical hypotheses are generally trying to explain something. Like if you take, for example, the whole debate about universals versus nominalism. This is a debate between different hypotheses that are trying to explain similarity facts, trying to explain facts like Fiona is similar to Fritz in respect of them both being hippos, right? Like, all right, what's going on there? What makes two things similar to each other versus not, right? Okay, so explanatory power is another one. And then finally, simplicity. And there are lots of different kinds of simplicity. In the book, I kind of think in terms of there's elegance and parsimony, and then I focus a lot on parsimony, and I talk about the two different kinds of parsimony, qualitative and quantitative parsimony, and so forth. And so parsimony kind of tends to work as a nice tiebreaker. A lot of people use it that way, when you've got hypotheses that are otherwise on a par. Sometimes simplicity in some respect, such as parsimony, is sort of the way to go. Like, all right, take the hypothesis that only gives you what you need and nothing more than what you need, roughly speaking. Yeah, so those are the virtues that I use. And as I work through the book, I should say the purpose of the book is mostly to develop this phasalist metaphysics and kind of defend it against obvious objections and so forth, not necessarily to argue that it is superior to all the rival views out there. But I do try to highlight its virtues where I see them. And so what I do is I take these three theoretical virtues, and as I move along through the book, I say, all right, here's a place where phasalism seems to exhibit one of these virtues. Or if there's a place where it seems, to kind of fail in one of these areas, I talk about like, okay, how serious of a failing is this, and that sort of thing.
Good, yeah. And like for conservativeness, for example, I guess we would have to say it's a bit of a mixed bag, right? There's maybe a lot of intuitive cases, and then other unintuitive cases. Whether it comes out on the whole better than, say, as certain substantialist views, well, I guess it's going to depend on the various virtues there, or how they fare on various virtues there. But as you say, you're not really spending a lot of focus on defending it as the correct view, but sort of developing it, maybe defending some of its virtues and showing that it's like a plausible candidate. Maybe that's how you put it.
Yep, that sounds fair to me. Yeah. I think what I say in the book is it's a partial defense of phasalism. So it's like I'm doing some of the work, but not all of the work that would go into showing you should be a phasalist,
Right. Yeah, fair enough. And one thing you mentioned there concerned here, this is a sort of project of someone that's a fan of first order metaphysics. And I was wondering what you think of, because in the book you sort of set aside some of the more deflationary views, like Hirsch's quantifier variance stuff, and Amy Thomason's easy ontology, and some other things like that. I mean, maybe can you talk a bit about why you prefer that approach? Like, what would you say about those sorts of approaches?
Yeah. So I guess let's take Hirsch's view as an example. right? So Hirsch's view is this quantifier variance view. And he says basically that when we use quantificational language, like exist and being and there is and stuff like that, there's actually different things that you can mean by those terms. And a lot of times in philosophical debates and in metaphysical debates, people are just talking past each other because they're using their quantificational language differently. So they might appear on the surface to be robustly disagreeing about like whether there are hippos, and in fact they're not. They're not actually disagreeing about that because they mean different things by there are hippos. Yeah, so what do I think about this view? So a couple of things. One is that I think that a lot of people are motivated toward views like this one by an intuition that there's a shallowness to metaphysical debates. That it just sort of seems on the surface like this debate doesn't really seem like a real, there's something's fishy going on here. This doesn't seem like a real disagreement. Some people report having this kind of intuition. I don't know if I have that intuition myself, or at any rate, I don't know if I have it anymore, if maybe I once did. And so I find myself not really drawn toward the deflationary view in the way that I think a lot of people are. So that's one thing to say about it. Another thing to say, at least about Hirsch's view in particular, is I'm not sure. Well, actually, not even just about Hirsch's view, but I find it that I have a difficult time even understanding deflationary metaphysics. And so in the case of Hirsch's view, what I struggle with is this. So Hirsch's whole paper about this is arguing like this is not necessarily an anti-realist kind of view, this deflationary picture he wants to defend, right? So there is this realist aspect to it. Like there's really a world out there that's not dependent on our minds. It's not constructed by our minds and so forth. And what I don't understand is, well, what is that world like such that quantifiers can vary in the way that Hirsch says that they vary? And I just struggle to understand this. I think the view that makes the most sense to me when I try to make sense of this would be something like an ontological pluralism, like what Chris McDaniel defends. Like maybe there are different modes of being corresponding to these different meanings for the quantifiers. But I'm pretty skeptical about whether that's what Hirsch had in mind. In fact, I don't know that it even really fits the spirit of his view. It sounds like it might be too much deep metaphysics for him. And so I kind of even struggle to understand deflationism, to be honest with you. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I partially agree. I'm definitely more amenable to this than I think you are. So I'll say a couple of quick things. One is, I did recently have 2 interviews on the philosophy of time related stuff. And one of the things that come up there for me is like, I wasn't really convinced that certain disputes in the philosophy of time are actually substantive. For example, having to do with whether some sort of A theory and B theory are actually asserting different things, or because there's a way to interpret the statements or the certain sort of slogans where we assert, when we say only the present exists, well, is that temporally indexed or not, right? And then there's a way to make that not actually a substantive dispute, and I'm not sure that there's a way to make it clearly a substantive one. Maybe there is, but it wasn't clear to me. So now that obviously thinking that that's not a substantive dispute or might not be, it doesn't necessarily commit me to some sort of anti-metaphysical view, I guess. But still, I do worry about that sort of thing in that debate and others. The second thing I'll mention very quickly, I do wonder though, like sometimes when people talk about different modes of being or the quantifier variance stuff or stuff like that, to what degree is that the right account of what's going on there versus, like, I don't know, there's a sort of appropriate paraphrase on certain existential language when really we're just asserting something that doesn't actually require the existence of something in the usual sense, but isn't actually committed to some sort of deflationary. So like, I'm actually, in some cases, I'm not sure what the difference there really is supposed to be. Like, if we could agree to use the existential language in this sort of singular way, I guess okay, I guess there's a substantive dispute there between someone who thinks that there's different modes of being, I suppose, if that's supposed to be something kind of robust, like there's a fictional mode of being, or there's a, I don't know, some other mode, and those things really exist, and it's not just another way of speaking. Well, they exist in some sense anyway. I don't know. I guess I haven't really said a whole lot, but I could probably ramble further, but
Fair
I don't know. But yeah, I do kind of like, what was Thomason's book, the Ontology Made Easy, or I forget what it was called exactly, but I do kind of like some of the stuff she says in there. But
yeah, her stuff is definitely very interesting. And I'm still kind of trying to decide what I think about Thomason's view. Actually, there's something about it that strikes me as suspicious. It's sort of like, I guess maybe this is just like an anti-deflationist intuition that's very inchoate. That's sort of like the opposite of the deflationist intuition that some people seem to have. But I haven't been able yet to kind of really spell out what about Thompson's view strikes me as wrong, I guess. Sorry, did I say Thompson? I meant Thomason.
Thomason, yeah. No, fair enough. But yeah, good. Okay, we should. Yeah, so I was wondering, you sort of briefly introduced phasalism and substantialism as the kind of two, substantialism is perhaps the most popular view, but of course there's various different sorts of substantialist views. Yep. I was wondering if you could give a kind of bit of an overview of some of those views, maybe using the lump statue case as a way to describe them.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So take the lump in the statue again. Artist starts with a lump of clay, molds it into a statue. This is a phase sort, or sorry, this is a phase sort. This is a sortal change. Whether it's a phase sortal change is the whole debate, I guess. But so we change from one sort of object into another sort of object. And here I just kind of rely on ordinary language as a guide to what counts as a sortal change. And it just seems like in ordinary language, it's natural to say the artist turned a lump of clay into a statue or something like that. So sortal change. All right. Now, what are the different ways that you could interpret this sortal change? Well, I've already given the phasalist interpretation. The substantialist interpretation, though, as you say, is not just one interpretation. There are many different kinds of substantialism. So there are four that I focus on in the book. One of them goes like this. It says, hey, look, what happens when the artist molds the piece of clay into a statue is that the piece of clay literally stops existing. It goes out of existence and is replaced by the statue. So we have two different objects, one at the beginning of the change, one at the end. The one at the end, the statue, is also a piece of clay because, it's made of clay, but it is not the same piece of clay that you started with. So I call that replacement substantialism, where you get the original object replaced by another one. That view, the most discussed version of that view is Michael Burke's theory. He's the one who kind of introduced that to the literature. But it's not a super popular view. A much more popular view is what I call collocational substantialism. And collocational substantialism says that when you have the piece of clay getting molded into a statue, the piece of clay does not stop existing, but the statue does start to exist as a new object. So what happens is you have the statue and the piece of clay located in the same place at the same time and made of the same matter, but they're two different objects. So they're co-located with each other. This view, super popular, probably the most popular version of substantialism. But another popular kind of substantialism is perdurantist substantialism. So this is based on the perdurantist theory of persistence, which is the theory of temporal parts. The idea being that when objects persist over time, they're spread out or extended across time in something a lot like the way that they're spread out or extended in space. So I'm extended in space by having different parts in different places, right? I've got like one hand over here and another one over here and so on. Well, according to the perdurantist, I'm also spread out in time by having different parts at different times. So I have like a Monday part, a Tuesday part, and so on and so forth, right? And actually, a typical perdurantist will say that every temporally extended object is made up of infinitely many momentary stages, these momentary temporal parts that only last a single instant. And then there are bigger temporal parts that are composed of these momentary ones. All right, so what do they say about the statue and the piece of clay, or this sortal change? What they say is you take the piece of clay, you mold it into a statue, and what's going on here is you have a series of piece of clay stages followed by statue stages, and all of those stages together compose the piece of clay, the temporally extended piece of clay. But only the statue stages taken together compose the statue. So the statue turns out to be a temporal part, a proper temporal part of the piece of clay. And so on this view, yes, the statue does start existing when it is molded, because that's when the statue stages begin. And so it ends up being a substantialist view. Okay, then one more view, and this one is a close cousin of the perdurantist view, the exdurantist view, or the stage theoretic view. It's called different things by different people. So exdurantist view is very similar. You have the series of stages, first a piece of clay stages, then statue stages, except for that according to the exdurantist, each of the piece of clay stages is itself a whole piece of clay, and each statue stage is itself a whole statue. And these stages are counterparts of each other. So the way that things persist over time, according to this view, is by having counterparts at other times rather than by actually being at other times. So why does the piece of clay last for more than an instant? Because there are other piece of clay stages at later times that are counterparts. Okay. And then, of course, since the statue stages don't begin until in the middle of this sortal change, what we have here is a substance sortal change according to the typical exdurantist, because the statue stages are not statue counterparts of any of those mere piece of clay stages that came before them. So the statue counts as like starting to exist at that later time. Okay, so those are the four versions of substantialism that I focus on in the book.
Good. Yeah, just a couple quick remarks on the co-locationist view or coincidence views. It could even be that it's not even just they could overlap for their entire career, so to speak, or for their entire life, but still be distinct objects, right? Or at least that's a popular view, right?
You mean like, so there's this really famous case from Alan Gibbard, where you have a piece of clay that is formed. Well, you have, let's see if I remember how this goes. You have a statue that's formed taking two halves of clay and putting them together. And so a new piece of clay and a statue are formed at exactly the same time. And then
and then we can suppose they're destroyed at the same time. Yeah.
At the same time. That's right. Yeah. So they start and cease to exist simultaneously. Is that the case you're thinking of?
Exactly that sort of thing. So then the idea would be like, well, I mean, I guess you could be a substantialist or, accept coincidence in this way, but think that those aren't distinct objects. But I think maybe a more common view would be to say that they are distinct objects, maybe because although they never come apart in that way in terms of their constituents and so on, they could, right? They have different modal properties, maybe they have different persistence conditions, and that's enough to make them different objects or something like that.
That's right. So
yeah,
I would say in that case, the difference between the phasalist and the substantialist is actually going to turn out to be modal in that case, because the substantialist is going to say, if you had smushed the statue instead of annihilating it, for example, so that you still had a piece of clay hanging around, that would have destroyed the statue and it would cease to exist. And so there are actually two different things here, the statue, the piece of clay. Whereas the phasalist is going to say, if you had smushed the statue, it would have stopped being a statue, but it would have still existed because it just is that piece of clay.
Yeah, and in a sense, the phasalist is going to say there just is one object there, right? Well, and as parts, I guess, could be distinct objects, but there isn't the statue in the clay. It's just that thing. And it could have undergone a phase change, say, to stop being a statue, for example, but that still would have existed. Yeah. Or perhaps other things. Yeah, okay, so good. And then in the book, you present a sort of path to phasalism, starting with endurantism and monism. Can you explain? I guess you sort of talked about endurantism a little bit already, but can you explain those assumptions and how that could lead someone towards phasalism?
Yeah, sure. So that's right. So I lay out this like path to phasalism, or I call it a path because I mean, in a way, I mean, it is kind of an argument, but it's not one that I'm expecting to convince a whole lot of people. It's more like, look, if you already kind of lean in certain directions metaphysically, here's why you should be a phasalist. But a lot of people aren't going to already lean in those directions. Yeah, so it's founded on those two views you mentioned, endurantism and monism. So endurantism is the third rival in the group of the different theories of persistence. So we talked about perdurantism and exdurantism. So endurantism is the one that a lot of people consider to be sort of like the common sense theory of persistence. And the way that I think of it, it has two conjuncts. One conjunct is that objects are three-dimensional. They're extended in the three dimensions of space. Let's, for the moment, ignore the wrinkle that there might be more than three dimensions of space, just to keep things simple. So the object is extended in the three dimensions of space, but it's not extended in the temporal dimension. So if we're talking about like where I'm located right now, the whole of me is located in a certain three-dimensional person-shaped region sitting in a chair right now. And then the other, and so this stands in contrast to perdurantism, which says, no, you're extended temporally and you have these temporal parts at different times, etc. The other conjunct of endurantism, and this is where it clashes with exdurantism, it says that for you to persist over time is to be identical, numerically identical across different times. So it's not just that I have like counterparts tomorrow, that exist tomorrow, but hopefully I exist tomorrow, that something numerically identical to me exists tomorrow, and that's how I will persist into the future. Okay, so that's endurantism. And then there's monism. And I mean, the term monism is used for a number of different views. The one that I'm thinking of is monism about coincident objects. So coincident objects, as I use the term, are objects that are in the same place at the same time, made of the same matter. And then there's a debate about whether coincident objects are always identical or whether they're, in some cases, perhaps distinct. And so the monist says coincident objects are always identical. So the statue is numerically identical to the statue-shaped piece of clay that it coincides with. Whereas the pluralist, it's called, says, no, actually, there are two co-located objects here. There's the statue on the one hand, and then there's the piece of clay on the other hand. And so, according then to the monist, no, that's not true. They're always identical. And so what I want to do is say, look, both endurantism and monism are at least somewhat plausible views. Each of them have a lot of defenders. I think each of them are rooted in common intuitions that we have about how material objects inhabit space and time. I also think that they fit together pretty well. I don't think you have to combine them or anything like that, but that there's nothing terribly unnatural. Unnatural. Nothing terribly unnatural about combining endurantism and monism. I think it kind of made a nice pair. So some philosophers might find the combination of endurantism and monism attractive. And if you do endorse both of those views, you're only a small step away from phasalism. Because once you've adopted endurantism, a couple of the substantial versions of substantialism drop away, right? You no longer have perdurantist substantialism, you no longer have exdurantist substantialism. And if you're also a monist, then you no longer have collocational substantialism. So the last rival that remains standing is replacement substantialism. And for one thing, replacement substantialism is not a very popular view. And so but then again, phasalism hasn't been either. So I don't want to put a whole lot of weight on that. But what I do in the book is I try to argue using those theoretical virtues that I mentioned, that phasalism, the phasalist interpretation of sortal changes like the statue change is in fact the better overall interpretation than replacement substantialism. So it's just that final step to phasalism.
Right. Good. Yeah, because I was thinking like on one hand I find monism very very counterintuitive in this sense, but I do also see that there could be certain unintuitive consequences of pluralism. Maybe the most notable one that what I'm thinking about is that you know, for most pluralists, it's probably not going to be just two things there: the statue and the lump.
Yeah, that's
Really,
right.
if you can define anything with different modal or persistence conditions and so on, then probably there's many different things, maybe even infinitely many different things that are co-located there. And that, I mean, maybe that's acceptable. But I think we have to admit that that's a counterintuitive result of pluralism as well. So, like, yeah, I guess we're gonna have to weigh these things, and then the other theoretical virtues that you talk about. Maybe that's going to come out as a very unparsimonious view as well. But yeah,
And even if you're a little bit more sparse about how many co-located objects there are some cases where you're going to have to say that there are more than two. Like Mike Ray has this example of a pillar that's also a piece of marble and also a statue. And I think my knowledge of Greek architecture is deficient, but I don't know if like maybe like the Parthenon or something like that has pillars like this. But if you think about it, I mean, really, are there three times as many pillar-shaped objects in front of me right now so when I stand in front of this building than it looks like there are? I mean, that's kind of wild to me.
yeah. Or you can just have uh, like something could be I was thinking like of a statue of like a chair or something. In some sense, it's a statue, it's a chair, but it's also like a lump of metal or something.
Yeah,
Those sorts of things, and maybe and probably more and
good
beyond that.
example.
And what I'm thinking is, yeah, but plausibly certain sort of sparse views are a little strange. So I would think that like, well, if we can have the term chair, like, okay, and there's rough things. Okay, that's not a very precise term, but like we can have terms that capture very similar things or that have a similar extension, maybe that would include at least for a time that same thing. Then we could seem like we could multiply that, and then you have many different things that are co-located there. Maybe not a full, maybe not infinitely many, but maybe not something super sparse. But anyway, I guess that's maybe just to press some of the consequences that many people might find counterintuitive. But
Sure.
yeah, but at the same time, I do. It does seem really counterintuitive to me to think that no, there's only one thing there. It's just the chair or whatever the material object is. In part because it looks like there's different. Well, we have this term that can refer like clay or metal or whatever, or a lump of clay, a lump of metal, and it looks like counting as such. It has different. There's different identity and persistence conditions and modal conditions and so on for counting as a chair versus a bunch of metal and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe this is just to repeat a sort of substantialist or pluralist intuition, but I don't know. What do you make of that?
Well, one thing to be careful about here is I, as a phasalist, can agree that there
Yeah.
are different conditions for like what it takes to be a chair versus what it takes
Right.
to be a hunk of metal, or what it takes to be a statue versus what it takes to be a piece of clay. It's just that those conditions aren't persistence or identity conditions. They're just what it takes to be a statue, right? So you take a piece of clay and you say, all right, it hasn't been a statue all along. It only started to be a statue when it started to satisfy certain conditions, like an artist imposed a certain form on it or whatever, right? So those conditions, I can keep them. I just can't have them be persistence conditions.
Yeah. So I guess part of what I have to build into the intuition there, or in order for this to have some force here, it has to be that the persistence conditions are part of it. So like the, in the lump statue case, I have to really think, okay, there's conditions for being a lump, and there's including persistence conditions, and that's a certain sort of object, right? And once there's nothing there that sort of satisfies those, or there could be a further stage of a lump of clay, so to speak, then that object just ceases to exist. Or maybe it's easier in the statue case, because there we talk about the lump surviving that. Yeah, so I guess you just have to deny that those conditions are persistence conditions of objects, but you can accommodate them as conditions for counting as that sort of phase, something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
Something can count as a statue, and there's conditions where something meets or doesn't meet that, but that doesn't necessarily imply that the object which at a time meets that ceases to exist when it doesn't meet that, or something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Yeah, and I guess this does come to, because where this is in chapter 3 or something, maybe. But you talk about the difference between persistence conditions and a criterion of identity.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So maybe if you could explain that distinction, and I wonder if you think we should expect general conditions of the sort, like a criterion of identity, that aren't just highly sensitive to the sort of thing under consideration.
Yeah, good. So difference between persistence conditions and criteria of identity. Persistence conditions are just conditions on, well, to say something unhelpful first, they're just conditions on persistence, right? They are only the conditions that something has to satisfy in order for it to be the case that it still exists at the next time, so to speak. Anyway, so think about it like this, right? I have persistence conditions, and those conditions are the conditions I have to satisfy in order for me to still exist tomorrow, let's say. But one thing that those conditions might not tell you is they might not tell you which object tomorrow that exists tomorrow is me. They might only tell you that some object or other that exists tomorrow is me. To take a simple example, suppose that my persistence conditions are just spatiotemporal continuity. Well, what if I'm spatiotemporally continuous with more than one thing tomorrow? Well, it follows that I persist by those persistence conditions, but those conditions are not going to tell us which object I persist as. That's what a criterion of identity is going to do. A criterion of identity will tell you not just whether there is an object tomorrow that's identical with me, but also which one it is. All right, so that's the difference there. And then there was a second part to your question, I think.
Yeah, sorry, it just had to do with whether we should expect that there are kind of general conditions of the sort that aren't highly sensitive to the sort of thing under consideration.
Yeah,
so
good.
Yeah.
I end up arguing that this is true, but whether we should expect it like ahead of time, so to speak, yeah, it's a good question. One thing that comes to mind is that back in like the 70s or so, it seems like a lot of people thought that the criterion of identity for material objects was basically spatiotemporal continuity, with maybe a couple of qualifications here and there or something like that. And that is a sort of criterion which is going to be the same across the board for all material objects, or at any rate, that's how it was treated. And so you might think, well, there is something plausible in the thought that for all material objects, at least, they're going to share the same criteria of identity. On the other hand, I take what I think is your point, which is that, look, material objects are a very heterogeneous group. There are a lot of different material objects, and they have different kinds of parts, and they change in different kinds of ways. And so you might think, no, they're going to have different persistence conditions, depending on which kind of material object you're talking about. This view has been around for a long time. It's at least as old as John Locke, for example, who had a version of the view that different kinds of material objects have different persistence conditions. Anyway, so should we expect this ahead of time? Yeah. Honestly, I'm not sure. I'm committed to saying that in the end, that's what we should think. But whether that's like a surprising consequence, I don't know. Maybe some people would find it surprising and other people would find it less surprising.
Yeah. I think it really matters so much how surprising we find it, if we have good reason to think that's the case. But yeah, and you mentioned in the 70s, that sort of view, like Eli Hirsch's book, The Concept of Identity, he's something like that there with some qualifications.
Hirsch is a case where he does have a sortal condition built into his. So he does get a bit of the substantialist action going on there. I love that book, by the way. Right. That Concept of Identity is such a good book.
Yeah, I do like it. And as well, and I do like some of the relative identity stuff too. I might get that a little bit. Let's see. Yeah, and so thinking about the criteria or your criterion of identity that you focus on with spatiotemporal continuity, you also add this sort of change minimization thing. So can you expand a little bit on the idea you have here for that criterion?
Absolutely. Yeah. So once I kind of like initially motivate phasalism by outlining that path to phasalism, the next project I set out on in the book is to say, like, all right, what exactly are the criteria of identity for material objects? And I take this to be a really important question for the phasalist to at least try to answer, because the phasalist is giving us a non-standard view about what kinds of changes objects persist through, and what kinds of changes, are such that the object at the beginning is identical to the object at the end. And so I end up developing a criterion of identity, a phasalist criterion of identity for material objects. And I say that it's not the only one. It's not like the phasalist has to be wedded to this particular criterion, but I think it's a pretty good one. And it is broadly spatiotemporal in character. It's actually got a causal element as well. But basically it says that there are two conditions on identity for material objects. And in the book, I lay this out in a very precise way. Here, I'm going to speak very loosely. But the idea is roughly this. In order for an object to remain identical over time, the first condition it has to satisfy is a spatiotemporal continuity condition. It has to persist in a spatiotemporally continuous way. So no jumping through space and time like a time traveler or a teleporter. But more than that, I end up saying that the object at any point in its career has to occupy a region which sufficiently overlaps the regions that it occupied at neighboring times. How much is sufficiently? Well, this is the tough part, and this is where I end up coming down on, and you have a really good question about this that I hope we get to talk about. Where I end up coming down on the rule that the degree of overlap has to be, the region of overlap has to be larger than any of the regions of non-overlap. And this has the upshot that an object can't be cut down in size by 50% or more all at once. It can't survive that kind of change. So that's the spatiotemporal continuity condition. All right. And then the second condition that an object has to satisfy for identity over time is the spatiotemporal. Oh, sorry. Pause 1 second. There's also a causal component to this. So it's not just that there's like this spatiotemporal continuity, but the spatiotemporal continuity has to be maintained by immanent causation. And I don't know if we need to get into the weeds on that, but I do think it's an important component of the view. So it's not pure spatiotemporal continuity, but more like spatiotemporal causal continuity. Okay, and then the second condition is the spatiotemporal change minimizing condition. And here the idea is this. There are cases that Eli Hirsch talks about where an object is spatiotemporally continuous with more than one other object, because there are objects that have really large proper parts, and those proper parts are overlap, the object they are part of enough to be spatiotemporally continuous with them. So what do you do when an object is spatiotemporally continuous with more than one object? Criteria of identity has to have a way to discern between these cases. And so what I do is I say, all right, we need a change minimizing condition here. The object always goes whichever way is the most spatiotemporally conservative path that it can take. It changes as little spatiotemporally as circumstances permit. So, all right. So, and then again, there's a causal component to this as well. So we're not just maintaining this spatiotemporal conservativeness by accident. It has to be through immanent causation. All right. So that in like rough outline is the criterion of identity that I defend. And it's a phasalist criterion in that it applies to all material objects across the board, regardless of what sort they are. It does not entail that any object has to stop existing when it stops being a certain sort, or come into existence when it begins being an object of a certain sort. So that's what I mean by it being a phasalist criterion.
Right. Makes sense. And I was thinking, well, hopefully this is the question you had in mind when for the concern. Maybe I'll get through this in stages, but because I had a kind of long question here, and
Sure.
in the book you cover a bunch of tricky cases and see how this sort of criterion and phasalism more generally gets applied to that. And I wanted to cover the one that I found the most troubling to me anyway. So like, suppose I lose my legs instantaneously, right? But they exist in regions that comprise less than half of my total volume.
Yep.
In that case, on this criterion, I would survive. But okay, that seems fair enough. But instead, suppose that my legs had like grown a bit first, and so that somehow that's more than half my volume. Maybe that's not super realistic, but whatever, we could imagine it.
Mm-hmm.
And then they instantaneously vanish. In that case, because more than half they were the larger part of me, I don't survive that change. There's some new object, I suppose, that's the top half. Maybe it's a person, but it's not the same person as me anyway. That, I guess I had three different words here, and we can take them at a time. Or I'll get through them. I'll just say them all. First, it very much seems like I should have survived regardless. There have been people who have lost more than half of their volume. Okay, sure, it wasn't instantaneous, right? It's some sort of gradual thing. But like, even if it had been instantaneous, I think we want to say that they still would have survived. I'm pretty sure, but maybe that's a defeasible intuition. And second, it seems strange at best to think that this small difference in like whether my legs grew, like say another inch or so, like makes a difference to whether I survive or not when they vanish. Like we should get the same result in both those cases, it seems to me. And then third, like, and maybe this is the most strange one. Like if the legs merely separate from me but don't vanish, but they're more than half my volume, in some sense, that's what I continue as. That's me afterwards. But that like seems like the wrong result. I actually think I should have gone with the smaller part and not the legs. Yeah, so I guess those are three sort of related but separate words that I have here. Yeah. Also, and that last one seems especially strange if we go for an animalist view of personal identity, but I guess that's another thing that we might come to. But yeah, sorry if I ramble on a bit, but
no,
what do you think of that?
Good. Yeah. No, I love this question. And that is the one I was thinking of. I'm glad we got to it. Yeah, this is. I should say this kind of case is also the case that bothers me the most about the view that I've defended, and I do have a couple of ways to deal with it. So let me maybe give those ways, and we can just see what you think, I suppose. So one of the ways of dealing with it is. So there's this idea that I mentioned very quickly. Oh, I should say I consider this to be a case of a sort in the book that I call remnant survival case. So I talk about remnant survival cases where these are cases where an object seems, particularly with organisms, though it sometimes happens, I think, with artifacts as well, where an object seems to survive much greater than 50% like loss of its volume all at once. All right, so in the section on remnant survival, I say something really quickly at the end that I now wish I had made a bigger deal of, because it seems like an important fix for this kind of problem, and I moved past it very quickly. But I do suggest one way you could revise the spatiotemporal criterion that I believe is a phasalist-friendly revision to accommodate these kind of cases. And it's basically just that when you have a disruption of spatiotemporal continuity, that an object can survive that sort of disruption if there is another robust form of continuity that bridges the gap, like biological continuity. And so in this case, then, the idea would be that, yeah, you do survive as your head and torso and arms, because that part of you is biologically continuous with the original person before the legs are lost. So even though there's a spatiotemporal discontinuity, it's bridged by a biological continuity that saves your life, so to speak, in the case. That's one way of dealing with it. I don't know if do you want to comment on that before I give you another way to deal with it?
Yeah, no, I guess that seems plausible, but that would be to well, I guess sort of modify the criterion of identity a little bit.
It would, yes, it would be a modification.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it feels to me like if it's going to handle cases like this in the intuitive way, an improvement. But I guess I'd have to think about it more. But yeah, sorry, you can continue with the other potential
Okay.
response.
Yep, fair enough. All right, so the other way of dealing with it appeals to something we haven't talked about yet that comes up in it's in chapter 4 of my book, where I talk about sortal relative sameness relations, which are like relations like being the same hippo, being the same person, being the same tree, etc. And I give this account in chapter 4 of sortal relative sameness relations where they can come apart from numerical identity. And so it allows for situations where you have two numerically distinct entities that qualify as being the same person despite being numerically distinct. And so if you bring that part of this is sort of like the optional part of the metaphysics I develop in the book. Like, do you want to add this account of sortal relative sameness relations or not to the other stuff that I have? But if you add it, if you bring that in, you can say that although the material object that was there initially, the object that was made up of a head and legs and arms and so forth, ceases to exist in this case. Nevertheless, the object that remains after, the numerically distinct object that remains after, is still the same person as the object that was there before. So that allows me, it gives me like kind of like half of what one might want on this. I don't preserve the intuition that numerically the same person is there. But I do preserve the intuition that the same person is there. And anyway, any thoughts about that?
Yeah. I find that plausible. I mean, we're going to come to some of the stuff on sameness relations in a little bit. I suppose. Well, I guess I'm a bit unclear on what the real difference is supposed to be between the same person and numerically the same identical thing. But maybe if we're understanding them as being distinct in the way you have in mind, then a lot of the intuitions are going to be salvaged by the sameness relations, I suspect. But then again, I'm not sure we need much more than that. So yeah, but we'll come to that in a second. I want to bring up one more case because I was trying to think of other cases where like the conditions might be sort of lead to unintuitive results. And one that came to mind for me was like a red giant star.
Sure.
One notable thing about a red giant is that the vast majority of the mass and activity is like in a very small region, like they're kind of around the core. And so like if more than half of the outer area, right, were to vanish, or more than half of the material in the volume comprising more than half of it, right, were to vanish suddenly or become separated, I think we want to say there's a sense in which the star would still exist, especially since like the core, because most of the mass is still there and the activities would be more or less the same, like very quickly would sort of grow to a similar size, maybe a bit smaller, and it would continue looking and behaving in the same way that a star would. I want to say that should be the same star, not just like a new star that has this. There was a or a new object there, so to speak, because it was less than 50% of the volume of the original one. So could we give a sort of bridge principle there, or do you think that case is intuitive as well? Like,
yeah. So let me make sure I understand the case. I'm certainly no astronomer. So are we imagining? So you've got the red giant star. You have its core, and then you have like is it like there's like this thick outer, well, or maybe not thick, but there's this like outer layer that's everything, like all the rest of the star. And we kind of like imagine shaving all that away so that you're left with the core. Is that kind of what we're thinking?
Or sure, or even, I mean, you don't even have to shave all of it away, right? Because it could be, because the core is like much less than like 0.1% of the volume, right? And red giants are huge. So like even if you shaved away like 60% of the rest of it, right? Yeah. And the core is still there, and some of the rest of it's still there.
Yeah.
And supposing it was instantaneous somehow, again, it's a bit kind of unrealistic, right? Because any sort of change like that, you would expect it to be at least somewhat gradual, where you could, on your account, plausibly it would survive. But I guess the sort of more unrealistic cases is more testing, I suppose. So I guess I want to say, and I think what would happen, roughly speaking, if somehow that were to vanish, well, actually, not much would change in a sense. You would still have a star, and plausibly, I think we want to say it's the same star, even if it lost more than half its volume, and it would like quickly go back to looking and behaving in the same way that the original star did. So yeah, you could try to recover that by saying, well, it is the same star, and we can employ the sameness relations, but it's not numerically identical. Or you could try to recover numerical identity, as you say, by modifying the criterion of identity a little bit, where something like that would be preserved. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it seems right. It seems like I've got the same sort of options as before, roughly. Those two, plus there's the option of just beating the bullet and saying,
right.
You know, it's not really the same stuff anymore. It's sort of like I'm trying to think about I'm thinking about how this compares to like a rock, because if you were to get rid of, like, say 70% of a rock all at once, not shaving it away, but just boom, it's gone, then I think what you have left is only a piece of the original rock, not the original rock. Why is this different in the case of a star? Why not say that what remains is just a piece of the original star? Maybe it's because something about the core of the star is like teleologically important, like something with the way the star sort of maintains itself as a system over time. There's a certain kind of teleological continuity there. If so, then you could use that to make that move, where you modify the spatiotemporal criterion and you say, look, there's another kind of continuity here, a certain kind of teleological continuity that bridges the spatiotemporal gap. So maybe something like that. I think it's a good case, and I want to think about it some more.
Yeah, good. So some of that teleological stuff, or like when you think about an organism, maybe there's some more things you can appeal to, some functional stuff, or certain like homeostatic properties, or what sort of things are important to the organism, and so on. I sort of do worry, and then we can move on because I do want to cover a few other things before we finish up. I do worry that some of the appeals there are sort of more amenable to sort of substantialist views than certain phasalist views, because like if you're a phasalist, like why would these features be relevant, right? Because like I don't know, it just feels like it could just be a different sort of thing and not have those properties. So like, I don't know, you could add it in, but it seems to be a less natural extension to phasalism is maybe the worry that I have there, but that's not necessarily decisive.
That's a good thought. I think one thing I'm inclined to say about that is if you can think of, the phasalist might think of continuity of various sorts as a preservational sort of notion. Like it's only relevant to preserving identity. And so as long as there's some robust form of continuity that gets maintained, the object keeps going. And so maybe if you think about it that way, it's a little bit less weird than if you were to think about it as in this substantialist way of like, no, there's an object of a certain sort, and there's a kind of continuity that has to do with objects of that sort. And you only last as long as the continuity does, you know. I don't know. That's just sort of off the cuff thought.
Right. And then another concern we might have with this is that, well, if we don't want to admit, because when we think about certain fission cases, for example, well, wait, does continuity get preserved with both of those things? Say if I were to split into two people sort of out of where I am right now somehow, like would both of them still be me? And does adding on this criterion concerning like some sort of whatever we're adding on here, would that actually deliver that result? I think a lot of people want to say, no, maybe I don't survive, and this is like two clones of me that somehow that exist there.
Oh, yeah.
And you want to handle, I think, those sorts of cases in that way. If neither of them are, well, I don't know. I mean, well, I guess maybe if you want to comment briefly on the kind of, you cover different sorts of fission, but maybe comment briefly on that case. And you see what I'm getting here about how, like, if we start to adopt certain or modify the criterion of identity so that like certain teleological or functional or so on facts might bridge or might preserve identity.
Yeah.
Maybe that would preserve it in those cases as well.
Right. And so
You see
then
where
we
I'm
end
going
up
there.
with, yeah, good. Then we end up with a problem about fission, because if
Yeah.
you fission and you are biologically continuous with two resulting people, yeah, good. Let me think. What do I want to say about this kind of case? Right. It's like a wrinkle that isn't there if you just stick with the spatiotemporal criteria that I have, but if you modify it in the way that I've suggested, now you
Right,
end
it
up
might
with
come back.
yeah, you're right. You're right. No, this is good. May this may like revive the problem, and I think, I mean, one way to deal with that. I'm just going off the cuff here,
No,
but
that's good.
yeah, one way to deal with that would be to introduce a kind of like a no branching condition when it comes to continuity. And it's a little bit, I mean, the main worry I take it for that is it's a little bit ad hoc, but it's also pretty common in the literature for people to deal with fission in that way. And my view is sort of amenable to it in that I actually think that extrinsic facts can bear on the identity of objects over time. I have like a whole section in the book where I talk about this issue. Um, in fact, I think that in the end, pretty much everybody has to allow this. I think there's no way around it. And so maybe something like a no branching condition would be a natural way for me to handle that problem, if I were to take the view in this direction. But it's something I have to think about more. And I really appreciate you pushing me on it.
Yeah, good. No, yeah, I was thinking something like that. Like, oh, if and if you suppose that, well, if you can put it in terms of branching, or you can say like, at most one thing can if there's multiple things that otherwise satisfy those conditions, then like neither of them count as the original thing, or none of them count as the original thing, or something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a
You know,
different way of saying the same thing.
yeah. I do have a paper in Journal of Philosophy where I talk a lot about amoeba fissioning. And I give an account there that puts these things together. It allows for like biological continuity to retain existence. But then I have like, I think what I did is I defined, I'm trying to remember, it's been a while. But I think what I did is I defined biological continuity in such a way that if you get a fission event, that actually disrupts biological continuity. Um, but it's just a matter of like defining it in a certain persnickety way, and I don't remember exactly how I did that at this moment.
Right. Right. It's sort of harder to understand exactly how biological continuity is working for. I mean, maybe in the amoeba case it makes sense, but in the case of a whole person, it's sort of a little bit harder to imagine. I guess there's some sense in which they're continuous, but I don't know. Yeah. So you mentioned the sameness relation stuff, so maybe we should cover that a little bit.
Sure.
Could you maybe explain how that works and how it can have identity without sameness and sameness without identity?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, so this is chapter 4 of the book where I've come a long way, and I've said, the book is only 5 chapters, so I've said a whole bunch of things that are some of which are counterintuitive, and I'm offering the reader an addition to my metaphysics that might help with some of the counterintuitive things I've said. And what I do is I give an account of sortal relative sameness relations like being the same hippo. And it seems like, and the idea is to try to sort of preserve our intuitions about the extension of those relations. And the way that I do it is I pry apart those relations from numerical identity. So it might seem at first that a relation like being the same hippo is just numerical identity between hippos. And in fact, I do think that's like the most intuitive, obvious way to analyze sort of relative sameness relations. But it might be that isn't the right way, even though it seems like it on the surface. And if it turns out that it isn't the right way, what might it look like instead? Um, So I propose a different account that analyzes these sortal relative sameness relations roughly as similarity relations or as counterpart relations. I call this in one place in the book I call this like exdurantism for indurantists, because I kind of develop a kind of endurantism that uses exdurantist like strategies. So the exdurantist we've already talked about, has their momentary stages, and then they have counterpart relations between those stages. Well, the endurantist can have something similar. They have what I call object states. And following Sidney Shoemaker, I define object states as sets of property instantiations. So take any object and any time at which that object exists. For example, you could take me and the time that's present right now. Well, right now, I instantiate certain properties. And my current object state is just the set of all of those property instantiations, all the ones that I'm involved in right now. So I instantiate properties like having a certain height and a certain weight and a certain complexion and, whatever. And all of those property instantiations, there's a set of them. That's my current object state. And then at any time at which I exist, I have another object state. And at any time at which any other object exists, it has another object state. And those object states, I want to say, stand in various counterpart relations. What does it take then for, say, me to be the same person as I was 10 minutes ago? Well, it means that in my current object state, the object state that I'm currently in is a person counterpart of the object state that I was in 10 minutes ago. Okay. And so this way of spelling out what it is to be the same person or the same hippo or whatever allows me to say that you can have identity without sortal relative sameness and sortal relative sameness without identity. So first, take identity without sortal relative sameness. Here the idea is pretty simple. I'll use the example of if you take like a piece of clay, mold it into a statue of a hippo, squash it, then mold it into a statue of an elephant. The phasalist view is there's just one object here that sometimes starts out as a piece of clay, then it's an elephant statue for a while, then it's a piece of clay, then it's or a mere lump of clay, then it's a hippo statue for a while. But what this account of sameness relations allows me to do is it allows me to say, hey, look, when the piece of clay is in its elephant statue states, it is not the same statue as it will be later in its hippo statue states. And that's because the elephant statue states are different enough from the hippo statue states that they aren't statue counterparts of each other. So there you get identity without sortal relative sameness. Okay, and then the flip side of it is you have sortal relative sameness without identity. So here, take like a fission case, like the ship of Theseus. So you have the ship of Theseus, and you gradually replace each of its boards one at a time, and so you end up with a ship that's made entirely of new boards through gradual replacement. You take the old boards, you assemble them just the way they were before to get a ship, and now you have two ships, which are candidates for being identical with the original. So it's a fission puzzle. Which of these two ships, if either of them, is the original ship? It's a good question. It's a tricky question. Well, one thing you can do, although I think you can't say that both of them are numerically identical to the original ship, my account of sameness relations allows me to say that both of them are the same ship as the original ship. Because all you have to do is say that the ship states of both of the sort of resulting ships are counterparts of the ship states of the original ship. And so even though on my view the reassembled ship is numerically distinct from the original, the ship states can be counterparts of each other. Okay, so that's kind of the rough and dirty version of what I'm doing in that chapter, trying to preserve some of our intuitions about sortal relative sameness.
Yeah, no, good. I do like that as well. Okay, I did want to ask quickly about a relative identity there, because you're clear in the book that your view in general and here is not the same as relative identity. It's relative sameness without relative identity.
Yeah.
But I wonder to what extent the difference is like a matter of terminology. Because like I think a lot of the things that a relative identity theorist would want to say, in particular many of the important cases, like you could say this like basically the same thing in different words with the sameness relations. So like, is there really a substantive difference between keeping this as a distinct sameness relation versus just admitting that identity could be sort of relative? Yeah. So I guess what do you think of the difference there?
Yeah. So I think that there's a substantive difference, but I'm happy to be corrected about this. So here's what I think the substantive difference is. It seems to me that if you're going to go full blown relative identity like Geach, then you don't have a relation that behaves like classical identity. You just don't have it at all. Whereas in my view, you do have that relation. And I'm just saying that sameness relations are a separate thing in addition to it. I'm not replacing that classical identity relation with something else. Moreover, I think that those sameness relations, the thing, I mean, I'm okay with using the terminology of, oh, those are a type of identity relation. But I'm also insistent that even if we call them a type of identity relation, they are merely like causally supported similarity relations, basically, right? They're counterpart relations um, between states of objects. And so there's not anything more going on there than certain kinds of similarity and causal connection. I'm not sure exactly what a relative identity theorist, if they would take an issue with that, but that's something I wanted to emphasize.
Right. Yeah. I guess if someone's a relative identity theorist, well, especially if they're like a pure relative identity theorist, they would have to say that there just isn't anything that satisfies the numerical sort of standard classical numerical identity, satisfying Leibniz laws and so on. Or otherwise, yeah, I guess it just would be substantive. You're saying, well, there is something that satisfies that, and this is something else. So, yeah, I suppose that's right. Okay, one thing I did want to ask, because maybe it's not super important to the book, but I thought this was an interesting question. So you, as I said in the intro, you've also done work in theology and philosophy of religion, and I was wondering how your approach might be relevant to certain issues there. So, like in particular, when it comes to the Trinity in Christianity, could we say that the persons are the same God as each other without being identical to each other? Without be, like, so they count as the same God, but not numerically identical to each other, or not the same person as each other. What do you think about this as a way to understand the Trinitarian commitments, or do you think maybe your phasalist approach and sameness relations sort of aren't developed to accommodate cases like that?
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting proposal. It's an interesting way of trying to apply it. Actually, I have a paper where I do something similar, but it's almost like the reverse of what you just said. So if I understand correctly, the idea you're floating is, oh, let's say that the Trinitarian persons are numerically distinct, but nevertheless they're the same God, using
Right.
these sort of relative sameness relations that I'm talking about that come apart from numerical identity. So there, what you have is sameness without identity. I have a paper where I flip it around and I do the identity without sameness version of the Trinity, where the idea is that the three persons are actually numerically identical, but not the same person. And the way I make it work is I say that the divine substance instantiates personhood three times over. So there are three different instantiations of personhood involving the one substance. And then those instantiations, well, putting it in using the apparatus I use in this book, it would be that those are not counterparts of each other. And you'd have to spell out why exactly they're not counterparts. I don't remember exactly the details of how I do that in this particular paper. It's been too long now, but yeah, no, I think that that's a potentially interesting theological application of this metaphysical idea.
Right. Yeah. I wonder. Not going to think about it much right now, but I wonder which version of that actually makes or fits better with the standard commitments. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
it's a good question. I'll tell you this: the version that I went with definitely threatens to be like it's. Some people will say it's actually heretical, like because it's modalism. Um, I try to argue that it isn't modalism, and so therefore it does not commit that heresy, but it's at least controversial whether or not it does. Your suggestion about how to do it, I think, more clearly avoids modalist worries. I think it risks a little bit more of like maybe there's some kind of tritheism going on, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I take it to be my suggestion to be very similar to like a relative identity account. It's just using sameness relations, something
Yep.
like that. And maybe that can work without being tritheist, but maybe there's other problems. I mean, it's hard to give an account of the Trinity that someone's not going to claim as some heresy for some reason or another. But,
Yes, that's so true.
yeah. But anyway, so there's definitely other stuff in the book that people should absolutely check out, but we don't have a lot of time to cover. In particular, like how it gets applied to personal identity and stuff like that. Maybe if we had more time, we'd cover that. But I do want a couple of things before wrapping up. And yeah, so maybe just as a bit of a summary, like what do you want the main sort of takeaway from this book to be?
Yeah. I guess I want the main takeaway to be that phasalism is worth taking seriously. This view, despite the fact that it's been so badly neglected, first of all, it exists, so hopefully people who are unaware of it will now become aware of it, or at least some people will. And then secondly, it's plausible enough that we should spend some time thinking about it and considering it alongside other like metaphysical views about material objects. I think that's really the main takeaway that I want from this book.
Yeah, good for sure. And I'll include links to where people can find this on Amazon or OEP. But yeah, so okay, I do like to end with a more general kind of metaphilosophical question. What do you think is the value of philosophy, perhaps in general, or maybe more particular for you? But like, yeah, why is philosophy worth doing?
Yeah,
I know it's a broad question, but
yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of times when people ask this question, what they're looking for is instrumental value. They want to know, what is philosophy good for? Like what's the point, what can this help us accomplish? And maybe, what they're doing is kind of comparing it to science or something like that, where science seems to have like this really important practical upshot in that it enables us to develop all kinds of technology and that sort of thing. I tend to think, though, that philosophy has a lot of intrinsic and non-instrumental value. Maybe I'll just say non-instrumental, leave open the question of whether it's intrinsic or not. A lot of non-instrumental value. I mean, if you think about it, philosophy is fun. It's also just sort of like intellectually rewarding in a way that I think is non-instrumental. That's just a matter of like, wow, I'm exercising my faculties in this high level way. And that just seems like a good part of a human life, that kind of thing. So I guess I kind of want to, the main thing I want to say about the value of philosophy is, well, let's look for the non-instrumental value here, because I think there's a lot of it. Now, I don't want to deny that there's instrumental value as well, because I think that there is. Philosophy, I think, makes you better at thinking, and that's a highly instrumentally valuable capacity. But I think that the non-instrumental value, it's easy to overlook, and yet it's really what drives me. Right? I don't do philosophy in order to do something else. I do philosophy because of philosophy itself. So anyway, that's, I think, my main answer to that question.
No, good. Yeah, definitely share that for sure. In some level, like, look, there's a lot of these issues and questions and so on that are kind of worth exploring for their own sake. I mean, or or because we're interested in them, or because it's fun to explore them and so on. Yeah, and it can have, in some cases, practical or instrumental purposes as well, but doesn't need that. Like, there's a lot of things that we enjoy doing that even if it's not for some further in. But yeah, no, that's really good. So I guess we'll draw the questions to an end there. But thanks so much for coming on, Professor Mooney, and taking my questions and writing this book. And again, I'll leave links to where people can find it. But yeah, it's been really great having you.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks very much for having me on, and I really enjoyed this chance to talk about the book and promote it a little bit. Yeah, thank you very much.